My thanks go to Cameron for his wonderful lecture on this stimulating topic. I truly enjoyed reading your manuscript. Theologically speaking, I think his attempt that connects vocation of a therapist to shalom and peacemaking makes a lot of sense. My simple comment is it's profound, but in very simple, accessible way. And I wholeheartedly agree with the Cameron when he presents shalom as the ultimate goal of Christian life and peacemaking as the primary vocation of all Christians. Especially I appreciate his engagement with the vocation of a Christian therapist, which is often taken for granted in the midst of our preoccupation with professional advance and careerism. This topic of vocation is important and timely. Just think about it in the wake of 2008 financial crisis and various national scandals unfolding even now around the election of Trump, and sometimes involving the major newspapers to make their story fit to their political orientation. And I've been really worried about this steady demise of idea of vocation together with erosion of character in our culture. Regardless of their educational level, like many of us here seeking, the terminal degrees and occupations, it seems that Americans pursue the same goal, money and power. As a consequence, our social institutions are internally decaying and externally losing public trust of people. And similarly, integrity is increasingly a socially endangered species. So in this cultural milieu, Cameron's discussion of integration, integrity, vocation helps us to see the big picture. In other words, look at the forest where we all living, not just the small trees of my success, my dissertation, my job. He helped us to ask, why are we doing what we are doing now? Also, in light of this observation, I believe that distinction between the primary and secondary aspects of Christian vocation is very important because it brings the moral clarity to our professional lives. And especially I like the idea of peacemaking as the primary vocation because it serves as the common ground for Christians of all different walks. And also giving space for, each of us pursuing our own profession. In short, this is a right subject at the right time. But I have one major concern engaging with an important topic for Christians, and every responder, is expected to bring some criticism to the presenter, no matter how good the lecture is. So I'm not, raising questions any specific content, theological content ideas, but more about the methodology, more of the meta-ethical level in dealing with these key ideas of shalom vocation and peacemaking. In other words, if I use the Polanyi's framework, it's between focal and subsidiary. I agree on focal, but I'm trying to open the different dimensions of subsidiarity. Right? So the Cameron takes the virtue ethics or narrative ethic approach with a strong communitarian vein. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Right? And approach is very popular. Right? In other words, narrative provide the coherence for agent, to bring together, integrate different aspects of life and different realities in the midst of a fragmentation. So this narrative, vocation, integrity, it provides a very strong forceful line to address challenges of fragmentation many of us experience at the seminary and American society. But I'm wondering whether narrative approach is the most appropriate Christian approach to understand all these categories. Right? Again, the strength of narrative ethics is agent-oriented, so it fits very well with the therapist. Right? And also, this narrative approach is very popular because Americans are increasingly, especially young people, moving away from the idea of duty, okay, law, or obligation, and also deeply touches cultural sentiments that human beings are desiring animals. We're all seeking certain goal. And our desires and affections is, much more matter than our sense of duty or universal principles, etc., etc. So that's why, as we see in the work of McIntyre and Stanley Howard and Jamie, Smedes, this approach is popular among young Christians, especially in struggling with the question of fragmentation and the pluralism, because it gives sense of identity. Right? But here are my problems with virtue ethics in general, narrative ethics in general. Okay? My first question is, what's the role of divine agency, God's person and work, in particular, the Spirit in the process of virtue formation? I'll show my card first. How we deal with the passage in the Galatians chapter 5, the 9 fruits of the Holy Spirit. Huh? What's the actual work of the Spirit, operating through our worship, conversation, fellowship, all this process? Huh? So that's my first question. Second question is, where does Christian identity come from? Is it membership in a particular community, or its narrative, or our relationship with God? It may sound very trivial, but it relies on very different presuppositions. Right? Because our identity, virtue formation, it's not just a cultural communal product. I would say, I'm a convert from Confucianism, and Confucianism emphasized virtues far more than Christianity. So I could be a virtuous person without being Christian. Right? But I'm Christian. Right? Not because I chose Christianity, not because I adopted Christian narrative. No. God elected me. God shattered my old world and entered into my heart and invited me into covenantal relationship with God. So in other words, narrative follows my relationship with God. Narrative follows God's initiating grace toward me. So this is a focal point of my response. In other words, how could narrative ethics incorporate the divine agency, triune God? And I believe this approach is better framed by the covenant ethics. So what I'm trying to do is how covenant ethics offers a better framework to conceptualize these key ideas of shalom, peacemaking, vocation, and their relationships. Right? So first, idea of identity. And if I compare between narrative approach and covenantal approach, as I already said, in narrative approach, identity comes from the membership in particular community. Right? But in covenantal approach, identity is a matter of our constitutive relationship with God. In other words, it's relational. And I believe it fits very well with the psychological data. Thus, one's sense of self arises through relationship, the baby's relationship with significant others. And for Christians, God is the most significant other, which has a transformative power, transfiguring power of our identities that we received from our cultural community and our family relationship. Likewise, virtue formation, McIntyre, Stanley Howard, Jeremy Smedes, they all claim that this virtue is formed through the constant practices in the particular community and imbibing the narrative. So in other words, virtue is a product of practices. I do not disagree on this phenomenological observation. But for Christians, who is the main force or person behind this virtue formation? In other words, where does conversion comes from? Is it simply reading the Bible or story? Or is it the work of the Holy Spirit? In other words, for me, starting point for Christian virtue formation, which we call conversion, comes through the initiating grace of God, working through the Holy Spirit. So in other words, beginning of Christian virtue formation, because I could be still virtue as a confusion, but Christian virtue formation comes when God's grace through the Holy Spirit working in my heart and transforms my desires, my dispositions, okay, toward the love of God and toward the love of our neighbors. So, again, this dimension, this living agent of the Holy Spirit in the process of the virtue formation is, I believe, theologically important. Why? Because living in place like America today, under Trump's presidency, how I can sustain my faithfulness and faith. Even narrative doesn't make any difference. I'm reminding you of, for example, Dr. King's kitchen table experience. He inherited good narratives from African American church. But when he pushed to the corner with his back against the wall, it was a living voice of God that sustained him in the struggle. So I'm not denying the role of narrative and practices, but we always need to revisit these narratives in light of transcendental and immanent, love of God, who is still present among us. I could make a case similarly about shalom. I agree, your description of shalom, just quotations, others are wonderful. But for me, from covenantal perspective, shalom is perfection of covenantal relationship. Not just the interhuman, but international, and also even between human and other creatures. So in that sense, the kind of shalom we anticipate, pray for, in light of Genesis 1, is restoration of the beauty and wholeness of creation God intended from the beginning. Then, what is peacemaking means in this covenantal framework? I want to just add one dimension. It's not just peacemaking, but it is just peacemaking. And Cameron emphasized that shalom is not sentimental thing. It's actually, based on the just righteous relationship. So I completely agree with you. But what I'm trying to do in light of covenant ethics is, covenant means put things right. That's a covenant. So for Jewish people, it's called tikkun olam, fixing the world, fixing the creation. So in covenantal perspective, the task of Christians is peacemaking, but it's not just the peacemaking, but it is a just peacemaking. So my question to my colleagues, especially clinicians and psychologists, is whether clinicians today can incorporate prophetic role in their counseling. Because I have some suspicion toward this whole triumphalism of therapeutic triumphalism, advanced by Joel Osteen and many mega churches. And it's almost like saying peace when there is no peace. I mean, sometimes I worry about what does therapy mean for those people, especially rich, white, all those Wall Street. What does it mean gaining the control of autonomy, all that psychotherapy provides? Now, I know that my colleagues are not there, but me as an ethicist, I ask a question. Whether sometimes clinicians help people intentionally and creatively maladjust to our society. Because our society is, in my view, in many aspects, so moved away shalom that God intended for us. So in conclusion, what I'm doing is not rejecting Cameron's wonderful ideas, but I'm inviting to relocate these ideas in different subsidiarity framework, the covenant. And I truly enjoyed this opportunity to engage with my renowned scholar and colleague, and look forward to ongoing conversation on this important topic as we share our journey toward Shalom community. Thank you.